Hello, fellow Group 3 members. I'm going to be doing my theological figure presentation on John Chrysostom. I'm going to be referring to him as John for the sake of time from now on. He was born sometime between 344 and 349 in Antioch. His father was a senior government official, and he died when John was very young, leaving his 20-year-old mother, who is said to be a devout Christian, to raise him alone. It's said that by multiple sources that his mom did not remarry so that she could devote herself in her life to him and to his education. This education that he received was high quality education and focused on the classics and rhetoric. He studied under a famous Greek teacher, Leibniz, and we see that even Leibniz saw him as a good student and would have had him replace him as teacher if the Christians hadn't taken him. We also see that he started off his professional career by studying law and becoming a lawyer, but soon he found that this was a little bit morally challenging to the way he saw things, and so he felt more and more led to Christianity and ministry. He attended a monastic school and was ordained a lector, and served the church in this way. And we see that he felt called to the secluded aesthetic, this lifestyle that is free from indulgences and spending time in contemplation. He's called to this, but he promised his mother that he'd wait to do so until she had died so that she wouldn't be left alone. We see that once she died, he went and lived in mountain caves outside of Antioch. And during this time, he spent much time memorizing the entire Bible. But health issues forced him to return to the city after a few years of doing this. He returns to Antioch around 378 and becomes a lector again in 381. He was ordained a deacon, meaning he could assist with the sacraments, and he kept on moving up in the ranks. And in 385, he was ordained a priest and served as a priest in Antioch Church until 398. He becomes well known for his preaching skills, and we see that the people there loved him very much. It's during this time that, again, his preaching becomes well known, and it's during this time where his preaching helps lead to his nickname that comes later after his time of Chrysostom. That's not part of his real name, but it comes from the word golden mouth, and so he's known in history and shortly after his death as somebody that's words were worth gold, and so we see that was something that was really a part of who he was. It was in 398 AD that John is appointed the Bishop of Constantinople by a civil leader that was empire-linked. They desired to have a great preacher, and they wanted to have this guy that was well-liked there in Constantinople as the bishop. But John was not too excited about this, and so history tells us the empire had to send troops to basically kidnap him and take him to Constantinople and make him the bishop. While he didn't like this transition, as we can see that he didn't go willingly, it is said that he soon accepted it as the will and the provision of God that he be there, and then he soon started his work as archbishop and doing it seriously. As archbishop, he attempted to reform the moral climate of the capital city in all levels. He did not shy away from those who were in government or church leadership, and because of this, he made enemies and had opposition from these areas as well. This also got him in trouble with the Empress Eudoxia, and I'm not going to pronounce that right, I know, but the Empress got angry, and she teamed up with a bishop that was jealous of him, and they worked to get him disposed or removed from his position and exiled in 403 AD. However, this only lasted a few days as there was rioting because of his removal. That's how well liked he was. And an earthquake also rocked the city and scared the empress, as she felt like it was a sign from God, especially since she could feel the effects greatly in her bedroom or her chambers. These two things had John back in town as soon as possible, serving once again as archbishop. And although he knew what could happen, he knew the consequences, he did not keep his mouth shut or compromise his beliefs about what he stand up for after this. He continued to preach in ways that were aimed at or at least applicable to the empress and the imperial family. And after the empress placed a statue of silver of herself outside the church that John preached at, John preached against it. And of course the empress was not happy about this and had John banished to exile once again in 404 on charges of treason. This time she tried to make sure it was more serious, though, that he couldn't come back. John died in exile in 407, and his remains were brought back to Constantinople in 438 and buried in the Church of the Apostles. Next we see, the next section we're going to is what is his significance in theology and church and his contributions. We see that he was venerated or made a saint by several churches, including the Eastern Orthodox Church and Roman Catholic Church. We won't go more into that, the more of the list, but he's also seen as one of the three hierarchs, one of the three church fathers of the Eastern Orthodox Church as well. We also see that although he's not necessarily well known by the common lay person, we do see that he had a profound impact on the preaching and the way that we see Scripture and whatnot as well. He still has more than 600 of his sermons and homilies, writings that were designed to be applied to the how to live the Christian life in that time frame based on Scripture. There's much to be learned and gleaned from his writings, and although some of his writings were very aimed at his time and his context, and some will be very disagreeable today, there is much that we can find in these writings that can be applicable today and are still used in theology and are still used in preaching today. We also see that some of these homilies spoke against the things that we preach against today: abortion, prostitution, gluttony, swearing, as well as other popular forms of popular entertainment in that day. We also see that because of his great speaking skills, he's still referred to as one of the best preachers that the church has ever known. And we see that by example of his sermons that are still available, that he was pretty good. He focused on Paul, as we see in this picture. We can see that he really admired Paul's writings. We see that he had saw great importance to hermeneutics and study, and also in preaching of the Scripture, to use those use hermeneutics, and he wrote multiple exegetical works and commentaries on the books of Genesis, Psalms, Matthew, and John, and of course the letters of Paul, as we talked about. We do see that his work and the way he saw hermeneutics does inform greatly how some people see hermeneutics today. We also see that he provided a great example of how to see and minister to the poor and needy. And we also see that he brought quote-unquote splendor and improved that to the church services through his liturgy that he compiled. He introduced new types of singing for special services such as vigils, and wrote several prayers. And many of these prayers, these liturgies, are used today in a lot of high church settings, especially the Eastern Orthodox Church. But we see a lot of these things have affected or influenced or impacted churches of many different denominations, whether they know it or not. A lot of his writings and his liturgy still influence the church today. And so finally, we want to look at his interaction with the empire. John literally lived in an empire, and it was an empire that had recently become heavily Christianized by Emperor Constantine before John's time. And so he was really faced with the reality that the church and the empire were heavily entwined with each other. And while he did not necessarily speak too much against how these two shouldn't be entwined, or about how these shouldn't be entwined, he was very vocal, as we had touched on, about the sins and corruption that could be seen in each side of these, but also in the relationship between the two. He might not have said this shouldn't happen, but he said this is what's wrong with it. We can't have this in it. We see several events that kind of get him directly involved with the empire. We see him preaching against the empress, and it was a time where the empire, the emperor, and the empress were regular attendees, because this was part of the government making the church something official. But we also see that the government was one who put him in place of power, and so we have this anger against him, but he was in power because of the government. So we see this kind of interesting relationship between him and the empire. The empire strongly shaped his theology and contributions to the church in ways beyond what I have time to discuss tonight in this video, and hopefully we'll be able to touch on some more during this week as you ask questions. But I do want to touch on a few things in the time that I do have, and hopefully I'll be able to touch on all of them. The first thing we see is this event called the riot of statues, was a time where there's high taxes, and people of Antioch knocked over statues and rioted. And we see that since this was a treasonous act, there was many executions that happened because of this. We also see that there's a possibility that the emperor would come and destroy Antioch, and so we see that the people were upset, and also the emperor was upset. But we see John taking the time and not being not wavering during this time, but speaking to this situation in a way that was strong and bold. We also see that again, that he was not afraid to call out the sins of those in power. He was not afraid to call out the sins of the empire and the emperor and the empress. We see that even though they were punishing him, he stands firm, and we see that he practiced what he preached and did so boldly. Even if it meant that he wouldn't be in this position anymore, even if it meant that he was going to face exile, if there was something wrong in the empire, he could not stay silent. I also think that the empire shaped him and his beliefs about relationship between morals and religion. He greatly believed that there shouldn't be any separation of morals from religion, and that the cross and ethics must go hand in hand, which is why he spoke on the topics I mentioned before. I believe again that it was an important thing for John, because with religion becoming a part of the empire and vice versa, there was and there would continue to be a danger to disregard morals, especially with those who are wealthy and many times selfish and not necessarily the best religious people, were the ones that increasingly had power in religious matters, and so it was important for morals to stay there for John. This also plays big into where he saw importance for the poor and those that were in need. We see in Antioch that it's said that his church provided for as many as 3,000 children and widows. We also see that he still lived this ascetic lifestyle as a bishop. We also see that he sold possessions of the church and also forgoes some of his financial compensation to help keep hospices and hostels working. It was his appreciation for the aesthetics and what he saw in the vanity of the empire and even the church that led him to speak for those in need and against those who were wealthy or seemed to hold no regard for the poor. It is the vain empress who continually dressed in overly fancy ways and placed a silver statue of herself close to John's church that I believed helped contribute greatly to his theology of poor and the wealthy. And before I finish this video, I wanted to share a few quotes that I think speak to his disdain to the wealth and the imperial family. And I think they're a good way to close this video and give you a taste of what came out of his golden mouth. The first one on the left of the screen. Do you pay such honor to your excrements as to receive them in a silver pot when another man made in the image of God is perishing in the cold? You're going to the bathroom in a silver toilet, but you don't care about the people. It's foolishness and public madness to fill cupboards with clothing, to have much, while somebody's standing naked outside, he's saying. And this quote, you can read it yourself because of time. But we see that John saw and acknowledged the state of the empire and its people, and greatly affected how he preached and acted. He may not have won the battle against the empire, but we do see that he won by not backing away and from the truth and from what he believed, even when it meant sacrificing his position in himself. I'm curious to your questions and your thoughts. There's much I didn't have time to touch on enough or at all. I hope you all have a good night, and I look forward to our discussions. I apologize for not speaking about all of it, but hopefully I touched on enough that we can have a good discussion. Here is some of the works that I use as well.